Hi, I'm Daryl Wanzer-Serrano.
I'm Ariana Ruiz.
I'm Rene Rocha, and this is Imagining Latinidades.
So thank you so much for joining us here at this conference to hear what we have to say about teaching Latino, Latinx studies in the Midwest. So the three of us, I'm Daryl Wanzer-Serrano.
Ariana Ruiz.
Rene Rocha.
And we are all professors here at the University of Iowa. I'm the current director of the Latino Studies program. Renee is the past director, and Ariana teaches like half of the classes that the program offers. Something like that.
Yeah, something like that.
We do have a live audience, a lively audience here for us today. So thank you so much for being here. What we'd like to do is talk a little bit about where the kind of podcast comes from, and then talk a little bit about where we all come from, and then get into talking about some specific examples of how we engage in pedagogy that is kind of uniquely suited to teaching Latino, Latinx studies in the Midwest context. So first, a bit about this program. This podcast was started as part of a grant program called the Mellon Sawyer Seminar. The Mellon Sawyer Seminar provides some resources to bring a bunch of speakers in. This conference's keynote speaker will be one of our speakers in the spring, and in all, we're bringing in over 24 speakers over the course of the year. We live stream most of those speeches. We're also producing videos that will end up online and freely available afterward, in addition to the kind of typical thing of we're planning to do an edited volume out of it. We also wanted to do something a little bit different, and that's where the podcast came in. So the podcast is kind of an opportunity for us to preview the scholarship of people who are coming in to campus over the course of the year. It's also an opportunity to kind of review the things that we've learned from the different speaking events that we've hosted. And it's an important opportunity to engage in what I'd call kind of public scholarship, publicly engaged scholarship, right? When you're doing something like a podcast, it's a much different language, a different style of presentation than you would have in a kind of typical scholarly research presentation sort of setting. And I think that's really important when we're talking about Latino, Latinx studies, right? The roots of which come from student movement and protest, and that is, it's always had a really important connection to community, right? And so it's important to both like create these spaces within the university context where our scholarship is valued, and where the lives of the people and the communities that we come from are valued, but it's also important to be able to like translate that work and discuss that kind of scholarship in a language that goes beyond the walls of the academy, which can be pretty exclusive. And so tell quickly where I come from. I'm a Boricua from Washington State, from Western Washington State, and I grew up out in Western Washington. I moved to the Midwest to Indiana for graduate school, and then kind of hopped around before landing back in Iowa, in the heartland, and found myself, amidst all this exciting stuff that was happening, because when I got here to the University of Iowa, there was no Latino Studies program, but there was, my first year here, an amazing symposium called the Latino Midwest, and that created an environment on campus, an energy on campus that I think pretty directly led to the formation of the Latino Studies interdisciplinary minor, which has since become a full-blown program, such that, myself and Renee have moved part of our kind of appointments into that program. And so it's actually a full kind of scholarly home for us, or second home.
Yeah, and one of the things I wanted to underscore in relationship to the Mellon Sawyer Seminar is this was sort of years in planning, or at least now we're going on our second year, the year where it's actually everything is coming together. And in those conversations, we were very much wanting to make sure that there was some sort of archive that we left behind in regards to all of the different types of speakers and events that we were going to be hosting. This type of energy and movement and presence by leading scholars within the field of Latina, Latino, Latinx studies is somewhat rare for the University of Iowa. Out of the Big Ten, we were the last ones to start a Latina, Latino studies program. And so it was really important for us to have some sort of tangible material thing after all of the different types of visits for future scholarship. And so that's one of the things that we're really trying to emphasize, not only by recording the different types of events, but also having this podcast as an opportunity to set up the visits that are going to be happening, as well as for us to chat with one another about, how things are going and sort of futures and directions of the type of work that we want to do. In terms of my background, so I was mentioned earlier, Ariana Ruiz, I'm an assistant professor of Latina, Latino, Latinx literature and culture in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. I'm coming from Inglewood, California. So first generation college student, grad student, and now faculty member. And really thinking about my place as someone from the West Coast that's coming to the Midwest, was something that I would say my graduate experience, I got my degree from Illinois, really set the stage for. And I'm sorry, I'm still working through whatever cough my 3-year-old gave me. So yeah, yesterday's recording was just like this, of me kind of turning my head to the side, so hopefully it doesn't pick up. But I'm sure the magic of editing will help just get rid of all of that, right?
This is live.
Oh. I'm like, wait, you can't just splice that out? No?
I mean, I can try to, but
Okay.
But if I do that, then I'm also going to edit in other sound effects and stuff.
No. We already have enough sound effects. So yeah, that's sort of my background coming in. As was mentioned earlier, I think all of the classes that I teach count towards the minor. Yeah, they do. So I have a lot of exposure and investment within the minor itself, and seeing it grow and having experienced its growth as well.
I'm Renee Rocha, professor of political science, and as Daryl mentioned, also holding a joint appointment in the Latino Studies program. I came here in 2006 as part of a Latino cluster hire. Omar, who's in the audience here, is also part of that cluster hire. That began sort of with an initiative towards sort of grow to diversify the faculty, perhaps create the energy for the creation of a Latino studies program. But the energy for that cluster hire, which initially brought me out, was very top down. It was sort of initiated by the provost's office, and we had some administrative turnover. The provost left, and what we had was a typical situation in which, I proceeded to be a really good assistant professor of political science. And I had lunch with Omar once a year or something like that, right? And then credit to him, credit to Claire Fox for, after a couple of years, after we had sort of navigated the tenure process, for beginning to institutionalize this program, both with the events that Daryl mentioned, and with and then sort of progressing that into the formation of the minor. I was happy to work to help move that along, get us to that program status over the past couple of years, get us to the point where now we can have the sort of joint appointments, and I think that's going to help sort of further institutionalize the program over the next couple of years. I grew up in the Rio Grande Valley, South Texas. One more Omar story is when we were sitting in faculty orientation. I don't know if you remember this, but Omar turns to me and he says, "Hey, he knows my last name," and he says, "By any chance, is your dad named Rudy?" Which is a really weird question to get asked, but my father is an historian, and it was a borderlands historian, and so that was a very very weird connection to be made in day one in Iowa City. But I think it sort of helped to sort of show how I think people, two people with very similar different disciplinary experiences, but similar lived experiences, similar backgrounds, had come and found ourselves, and we're trying to bring those perspectives here to the university. And so, one of the more interesting intellectual experiences for me over the past couple of years has been sort of navigating from that early life, living primarily in a border area, to where I've spent the bulk of my adult life, which is here, which is very firmly sort of not along the U.S.-Mexico border, but one in which sort of borders continue to persist in different ways, and sort of understanding that, intellectualizing it, and having it inform the type of social science and political science I do, and have me be interested in ideas that I was not interested in when I came here, like ideas of the way in which different spaces have effects on the way in which sort of Latinos conceive of their ethnic identity, and the way in which government has interacted with that population differently within the interior versus along the border has also sort of shaped a relationship between Latinos and the state, has been sort of a progression in my intellectual research path, which is informed very much by my lived experience here.
Great. So, one of the things that I want to do to kind of like ease into us talking about something specific that we teach, or some specific approach that we have to teaching Latinx studies in the Midwest, is to give a little bit of historical context about Iowa. And maybe you've had some of this earlier today about the history of Latinx folks at the University of Iowa, a little bit. I think I'm a critical humanist by training, but I've started getting, I think Renee's starting to rub off on me, and I'm like getting really into numbers because I think numbers, it is dangerous. I don't really know how to talk about the numbers or to do math, but I do know that numbers can tell an important part of the story that sometimes the archival resources that I'm much more like comfortable with can't tell. Unfortunately, those numbers are kind of absent at the University of Iowa prior to 1978, because the university didn't actually start preserving numbers about like Latino student enrollment here until that point. Prior to that point, though, we do have good archival sources, right? Particularly the student newspaper. And it was in like 1970, right, that students really started organizing in a quite visible way. At that time, there were about 20, the estimate is about 20 Chicano students here at the University of Iowa. The next year, through student organizing, that number went up to, I believe it's 28 in 1971. And by the time the university actually starts counting, 1978, there are 79 students here, which represent about 0.5%, 79 undergraduates, which represent about 0.5% of the undergraduate student population. The Latino population in the state as a whole at that point, well, in 1980, is about 0.9%. Right, and by that point, it's 0.7% of the undergraduate population here. Right, so I tell this in part to kind of demonstrate that from the beginning of the evidence that we have, right, students at the University of Iowa have always been underrepresented, and I worry that in the present moment, people might try to say, no, look, we're recruiting people at a rate that's higher than the state numbers right now. And that's like, that's sort of true, but also not true once you start digging into those data. So the current academic year, we're fast forwarding now many years, the student population is around 7.9% right now, which is actually, quite excellent, right? Yeah, I mean, we've come a long way. And really, the period from 2010 to 2014 was the greatest period of growth at the University of Iowa, right? So it's like after the cluster hires that happened in the late aughts, before and during the kind of Midwest thing, there seems to be an awareness of the importance of recruiting Latino students to the University of Iowa. Again, that always lags behind the state numbers as a whole. And we get to last year with 7.8%, this year with 7.9%. And that seems good because the numbers tell us that Iowa is 6.2% Latino. right? But when you break it down and look at college-age students, 18 to 24 years old, well, that's 8.5% of the state population, right? And really, it was only in the last couple of years that Iowa started recruiting Latino students at a higher rate from within the state than outside of the state. So it was just, I think, a couple of years ago that we crossed that 50% line, where half of roughly half of the Latinx students at the university, new students at the university, are coming from the state of Iowa. And so there still is there still is cause for concern. There still is a sense in which we have to be aware of the ways in which, right, Latino students remain underrepresented. And when we start talking about faculty, that's where the story gets really bleak, right? Because as a whole, in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, at least, it's about 3% Latino faculty. In terms of how many of those people actually teach Latinx studies courses, well, there's the three of us here. I'm talking about tenure track faculty. There's the three of us here, and there's two others who aren't here. Two
right now, yes.
Yeah,
that's a fair number.
We're still counting on one hand.
So you said 3%, Daryl?
3%, yeah.
So that's that works out to be about 15 faculty members total or so?
Math. Renee.
Right?
So
I forget the
yeah.
I think it's I think it was 12.
12,
13, somewhere around there. Yeah. And so that's the evidence is pretty good, right? That and we can come, we know that although we recruit at these high numbers, we don't graduate at these high numbers. We don't retain students at these high numbers. And I think, part of that, the reason for that, part of that story lies in that disconnect between the number of Latinx students and the number of faculty, right? We know from years of evidence in years of scholarship in higher education that when students see themselves at the front of the classroom, when they see themselves as kind of in meaningful positions at the university, they're more likely to succeed than when they don't. And so, we have to have that in mind, because I think that one of the other things that we know at a place like Iowa is that change happens when students speak up, right? When students have the spaces to speak up, and when they have the resources in terms of the intellectual resources, the political resources to be able to speak up, right? I mean, that's what really helped get Latino studies minor in place, was after all this great stuff happening and after this increase in students on campus, students saying, hey, we need to be seen and heard, and we need to be taken seriously in the curriculum of this university, right? And that's the story of how change has happened all along the way, right, since 1970 here at the university, right? Which makes coursework in Latino studies, I think, particularly important. Because at this point in time, at least, right, 90% of our students are underrepresented minority students. 88% of them are Latino students in the Latino studies minor. I think, of course, I'm the director of the program, so of course I'm going to say this. I think every student should be minoring in Latino studies, right? Because as I forget who it was at our opening conference, was it Sampaio or was it Martinez Ebers who said something like, you need to know this stuff so you don't make a huge mistake and look stupid, right? At some point, so you don't say something that's who was it? Sampaio, yeah, You need to have knowledge in this area when you're going out into the world, because if you're going to be, if you're going to be a CEO of a corporation, right, you don't want to lose that role and ruin your company because you said something completely historically inaccurate and just dumb about, people who are a pretty sizable percentage of the population in the country and in the state and in the surrounding states as well. So for me, I think a key part of any kind of curriculum in Latino studies requires like doing the work to provide those resources for students to be able to engage each other and engage the like institutional structures at the university.
Yeah. I mean, I think I teach, as I said earlier, all of my classes count towards the minor. But among those classes, I also teach the one required course, which is the Intro to Latina, Latino, Latinx Studies class. And when I designed that course, my research came into mind in the sense of space and the importance of space to tell certain stories. Part of what I've made sure to include within the syllabus is stuff on the cultural center, right? And the emergence of the cultural center as this important space. It's not one that just sort of happened or that the institution was like, here, you can have this, right? But it's one in which there was lots of student activism around there. And even thinking about the location of it and how that's changed and what that means for the visibility or invisibility of particular groups of students to campus. Along those same lines, it's very important for me to highlight the emergence of Latina Latino studies, again, as something that just wasn't given by the institution, but something that was very much fought for. And I kind of joke with them that I'm like, all right, I'm not trying to start any riots or revolutions, just giving you this information, and go do with it what you will. But I think a part of it is, again, informing folks that change does happen when you see yourself as a stakeholder within the institution and wanting to make those changes to make it better, not only for yourself, but for future folks that are going to be coming into campus. And so I think about that very much in terms of empowering students about the fact that not only have they've been here for quite some time, but also thinking about Latina, Latino, Latinx populations that have historically been in Iowa, also since, 18th century. So taking students over to the Mujeres Latinas project as well, which again, another shout out to Omar because he told me about that when I came to campus for the campus visit. And just being able to, again, expose students to that information, I think is so valuable. I've had students in the past who have gone on to do volunteer internships with them and now are including that within dissertation projects who have decided to go on to graduate school. And even thinking about presence, I'm teaching a graduate course this semester, and in conversation, they kind of mentioned like, you're the first Latina I've ever had as a professor in general, or as a teacher since like grade school to graduate school. Which to me, again, as someone who grew up in Los Angeles, was just so strange, right? And even thinking of like, I'm the representative. Okay, that's not a lot of weight on my shoulders. Let's make sure I don't mess this up. But yeah, it's been quite an interesting experience. And thinking about the different types of Latinidades that are also present here. That's the other thing that I want to mention. I think, again, coming from the West Coast, I was very used to Mexican-American identity around me. And that was my experience of Latinidad, right? And coming to the Midwest as a graduate student and now as a faculty member here in Iowa, it's so cool to really think about just how diverse the classroom is when we're talking about Latinidades, right? And what it means for me to really be able to speak to those different types of backgrounds within the classroom space, and how much I've learned from it in process as well. So I do think that's also something that's very unique to teaching Latina, Latino studies here in the Midwest.
Yeah. I mean, sort of like building on all this stuff, it strikes me that there's a couple different themes that are emerging. I mean, one is the role of Latino studies for Latino students, right? One is the role for Latino students, for non-Latino students, for white students here. And then sort of one thing that's sort of getting implied, but I think we can also tackle a little bit more directly, is the role of it for the institution as just a viable entity, as a, in some ways, like a physically viable entity. And so, I think that I've had sort of differing experiences with all of those sort of different facets. I mean, typically when I teach my classes, my teaching portfolio has evolved a lot over the years I've been here. I said at the beginning I was a really good assistant professor of political science. That meant that I taught a lot of just sort of generic political science courses as part of it. And as the university has begun to push for a greater listing of courses that hit on issues of diversity and inclusion, my portfolio has really gotten sort of inverted to the point that like 75% if my portfolio is some kind of diversity and inclusion related course, maybe a course on Latino studies, other political science courses that hit on these topics and therefore draw sort of different student bodies. But since I don't use like Intro to Latino Studies, I have a course which is still usually predominantly white. And so you end up in a kind of situation in which you're either exposing this material to a predominantly white course, or in some cases, a very bifurcated course. So, a classroom that's maybe 30% Latino, 60%, 70%. Not that good at math, apparently. White. And so those create sort of very sort of different dynamics as well. I think it's sort of very important for white students, non-Latino students, but given our student demographics, primarily white students, to be exposed to issues related to Latino studies. But there's also a very different dynamic that occurs when they're in a classroom, classroom of 40 that has 12 Latino students. That creates an incredibly different dynamic, because now there's a group of people that are sort of engaging them in conversation and sort of like validating each other's perspectives in a lot of ways. And so creating courses that can produce that student body composition to produce that dynamic, I think is one of those things that really benefit, again, the sort of the non-Latino and the white students increase the sort of cultural competency that Daryl was alluding to at the beginning. And then, of course, obviously, I think it goes without saying the value of that space for Latino students. The other issue that we sort of were bringing up there is the idea of it's important for the institution, not just for the students that are in the institution, but for the institution to begin with, right? So you talk about sort of the differing recruitment. One of the issues that we're really getting at here is continuing to maintain and grow the student body given the significant pressures that the institution is facing. It's historically tried to manage its student body by increasing recruitment from surrounding states. So other universities have made that market increasingly competitive. It's tried to expand its student body by getting more international students, but for a variety of reasons, there's sort of a natural limit to that. And so what it needs to do is sort of be more competitive at recruiting students in state who have a profile which hasn't traditionally been sort of seen as the type of student that goes to college, right? Or is it necessarily college ready? And so being able to go and make those students see Iowa as a viable option, right? And, is something that the institution has to get increasingly better about, right? And our program, I think, is situated to help them in that regard as well.
Yeah, it's great. You okay, Adriana?
I am. Got a cough drop, got some water, I'm good.
So in the time that remains, I'd like for us each to talk about kind of one thing that we've done or that we have planned to do, that I think is a unique strategy or assignment or something that kind of meets the goals and expectations that we've been talking about. And I can go first, unless you want to go first.
Sure, go ahead. Go ahead.
So I'm going to be teaching, right now I teach a course called Intro to Latina, Latino, Latinx Communication and Culture. And it's kind of it's a communication studies oriented Latina, Latino, Latinx studies course. It's a course that's in the communication studies department where most of my appointment is. But I'm designing a course that I've taught a version of before, just not here, and I'm excited to be teaching it here starting next spring. And that's a Latina, Latino, Latinx movement, protest, and resistance course. And so, in that class, we're going to take a kind of pretty big perspective, but really focus on, mostly focus on 1960s to the present, in part because that's where a a lot of my expertise lies in research on the young lords in Chicago and in New York, mostly New York. But also because I think that maps onto the kind of story of Latinx folks here at Iowa. And so, I want to take a kind of broad national focus and hit the big ones, right? Talk about the young lords in New York and in Chicago. Talk about the various kind of Chicano movement activism, student activism. But I also want to do. My plan is to do a significant unit on the University of Iowa. And part of this comes out of, in talking to my students in the communication and culture course that I'm teaching right now, they know like bits and pieces of the history of Latinos at Iowa. But there's, in kind of doing some archival research, I'm realizing there's so much more to this history that people just don't know about. Like just how in today's parlance, how woke the students were, right, at the university in 1970, right? The kinds of activism that they were doing was pretty radical, like much more radical than people usually think of when they think of Iowa, like nice, calm, everyone getting along Iowa. And so to kind of break up some of those expectations, one of the things that I plan to do is have students engage in archival research. Part of this dealing with could be related to the Mujeres Latinas project in the Iowa Women's Archive. But another great resource that we have is all of the daily Iowa newspapers are available, full text, digitized, OCR'd, online with some okay search features. Like you can search Chicano, right, which was the term that was used the most in the 1970s, and see all the different kinds of things that are going on, whether that's cultural events or students doing on the ground, joining in on the lettuce boycotts, for example, and what that kind of activism meant at the University of Iowa. So that's the kind of big assignment that I'm really excited to do for that class is get everyone's attention turned to something about either the University of Iowa or the state of Iowa in this period in the 60s and especially the 1970s, and to try to recover some of this history. I mean, part of this for me comes from the great work that's been done in history by people like Maylee Blackwell, her work on Chicana feminists, and this idea that she has that she calls retrofitted memory, and it's important to kind of be able to recuperate stories from the past, and to be able to fit those into a kind of model of meaning making, because those are the kinds of resources that both inspire people to act today and provide them with the kinds of intellectual resources and the political resources to be able to take action in the here and now, right? Not to say that everyone has to go out and protest This
seems to be another running thread then. Protest, revolution.
It's the theme of the class. I'm not advocating the revolution.
I'm not either, right?
It's not my fault if the facts and the available evidence lend themselves to revolutionary ideas.
You are there to provide information.
I'm just
right?
I'm merely I'm providing them with historical facts and documents, and what they do with that is up to them.
None of this is coming from the political scientists.
Right. There's a divide at the table.
One might suspect, but okay.
So that's the basic idea for this assignment that I'm already starting to think about, even though it's over a year away at this point, but.
So I guess I'll go next, and I'm going to pick up on the Maylee Blackwell reference as well, and take it back to the Latino Latinx Studies intro course. So as I mentioned, space is an important component to that course. In the last iteration of the course, I had them read a chapter from Maylee Blackwell's text where she's looking at, among various things, print culture. because I wanted us to think about this as a space where one can write themselves and their existence and their history. And so as part of the larger course, at the end of the semester, and during that time, we also spend some time with zines, which should not be surprising for lots of people in the audience who have now read lots of things about me writing about zines. So zines as these self-published magazines. So again, thinking about it as a space for Chicana Latina feminists who are writing their existence, queer identities as well, things of that nature. And so at the end of the semester, what I have the class do is we create a collective zine. So everyone is responsible for coming in with one page, 8.5 by 11, where they take one of the issues that we've discussed throughout the semester. And it could be personal. It could be them sort of thinking through a particular article or a theme for the course. But I want them to creatively produce one page that will go into, as I said, this collective zine. So the last day of class, we all sit around in a circle. We talk about what they brought in. They talk about its connections to the course content. A lot of the times it's connections also to their own personal lives. There have been pictures of family and their history here in Iowa. There have been poetry, paintings, like just anything you can think of. I had one student who it was their one page, but you opened it up and it brought up sort of different images underneath cutouts of from other courses that he'd taken with me. So stuff on like Los Vendidos and what that means in terms of his identity and belonging. So reference to Luis Valdez's work. And so it's just really great to think about it, how they can address these really heavy topics creatively, but also bring it together as a class. And so what I do is I'll scan everyone's contribution and I'll upload it onto our icon page so that everyone has access to it. Along with that, they also have to do a 2 to 3 page paper where they are thinking analytically about, okay, these are the things that I included on my page, and this is why I was doing this, and this is how it connected to other things that may not quite seem apparent on the page itself. But I've found that it creates a sense of community. It creates a sense of really bringing these, again, hard topics that you may think no one has connections to, but all of a sudden there you're seeing it on paper, and a real sense of intimacy as well. So just thinking about some of the poems that students have contributed, as I was photocopying the last section to scan it onto Icon, I had a colleague who came in and started reading one of the poems, and she just started crying. And I'm like, it's okay. What's going on? She's like, I can't believe that they're putting this on paper. And so the fact that they're putting it on paper and that they're circulating it with one another as well, I think is very important. And this is after like a semester of making them do critical response papers and exams and all of the things that are required from, this type of class, but really thinking about, well, can we move beyond that, and how can we connect to one another? I do this big spiel at the end of the semester that I think I say as much for them, but as much for me as when I was an undergrad student, which is we've sat here for 16 weeks, we've talked through these ideas, we've shared with one another. If you see, one of your peers as you're walking, between buildings, say hi, like just even a head nod, because it makes a difference. And so thinking about the space as not only them talking to me, but them talking to each other collectively has been a major project that I would say has been important within the class for me.
That's an awesome assignment.
Thanks.
By the way. I
really appreciate it.
It really is. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, these are much more developed pedagogies than I think I'm currently working with. And I think part of it is the different sort of roles of our teaching portfolios right now. I mentioned that earlier that a lot of my teaching has gone into these more diversity and inclusion courses. So, sort of like introductory gen ed diversity and inclusion courses is now like 50 to 75% of my teaching portfolio. And there it's very much in some ways, well, it's large. So, I'm dealing with 75 to 100 students, which is a different dynamic. Primarily political science majors, not necessarily people working even in social sciences or the humanities, right? So you have the like first year chem major who needs this gen ed credit. And there, it's really more of a frontline battle of trying to get like very sort of basic ideas accepted, right? Ideas like race is important. It's okay to study race. It's not inherently problematic to study race. Ideas like color blindness aren't necessarily the normative gold standard, right? And I sort of start the course with what is usually heard as a very aggressive statement. It's political science, of course, so there's a lot of rural emphasis of the government and state. And I say something like, this course is in some ways about how the state is an agent of white supremacy, and that sounds really inflammatory. But after 16 weeks of carefully documenting, after explaining exactly what I mean by that, right, I don't mean that as a like amorphous, ambiguous phrase. I mean something very concrete. I mean that the state sort of like takes material, non-material resources and it redistributes them in a way which is not equitable across all races, and in which communities of color receive less of those resources than white communities. And after engaging in how those examples play out in housing, education, criminal justice policy, immigration policy, all these different contexts, I think the case is pretty clear. But that sounds like a very aggressive statement, and then trying to get students to sort of see how that very aggressive statement is true. And this is where like the social science comes in, right? Where I really lean on the idea as true in a non-subjective sort of way, true by various sort of like objective understandings, as best as we can ascertain them. And, that also creates, like, pedagogically, I think these dynamics are also very different in the social sciences, right? Because you're leaning against that a lot. As you meet a lot of resistance in the course, you're leaning against the idea of, this isn't a subjective assessment, right? Like, this is like, that redlining exists was not a subjective assessment. That the K through 12, the elementary K through 12 institutions are in various parts of the country more segregated today than they were pre-Brown. It's not a subjective statement, right? And so I think that sort of like really leverages a lot of that creates a lot of buy-in, I guess, amongst some of those students, as they see that in that more, they see it as being sort of verified by these by this type of data, whether the data be what we typically think of as data as quantitative, or whether that data be just like historical information, ethnographic information, right? Just other sources of information. But that's, again, sort of like pedagogically, I think, sort of a very different thing. But it's good that we have this diversity amongst us and amongst our course offerings. And I think it links back to what we're talking about earlier, is the role of the program in the service to different constituencies, in the service to constituencies, to the Latino student constituency, and in creating space and in creating community, right? And then the program as a service to the broader institution, to non-Latino students, to white students as a constituency, and helping us sort of inform and educate that population as well.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I think we're basically about out of time, so we're going to close this down and then open things up for Q&A. Please, we'd love to hear your thoughts about this episode or any of our episodes of the podcast. We're on Twitter at ImaginingLat for the podcast. And you can also shoot us an email at podcast@imagininglatinidades.com. Please share this podcast with friends, as I always request, or one of us always requests. And when I stoop really low, please give us 5-star ratings on Apple Podcasts, because those ratings help to expose us to a wider group of people and give us a chance of maybe making it on one of those curated lists that Apple does. All that said, thanks so much for listening in. Thank you all here with us today for being here.
Thank you.
So please check the show notes for all the links and sites of things that we've been talking about today. And thanks again for listening.